As the clock ticked closer to the American Revolution, the would-be nation's aristocratic elite desperately devised a plan to convince the rural population to care about the consequences of maintaining the status quo. Economic boycotts in 1765 and 1768 had at least raised awareness of the issues, but the radical actions of the Sons of Liberty did not represent the majority of the colonial populace. Their harassment of royal officials, often while dressed in blackface or disguised as Native Americans, was unconvincing to most of the Crown's North American subjects. There was a growing sense that the elites, particularly wealthy Southern planters, many of whom were deeply in debt to the British, were steering a course that served only their own interests. Loyalist Peter Oliver described Sam Adams as so thorough a Machiavellian that he divested himself of every worthy principle and would stop at no crime to accomplish his ends. Adams was at the center of the powder keg that was about to explode, resulting in one of the most unlikely revolutions the world has ever seen. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students taking the AP US History course. This episode covers the second half of Period 3, 1754 to 1800, establishing a new nation. The Intolerable Acts had been implemented to punish Boston for actions taken after the Tea Party. Everyone was on high alert for the next inevitable incident. General Thomas Gage, the British military leader in the area, commanded 3,500 regulars. But they were vastly outnumbered by the more than 20,000 militiamen who had formed to safeguard local armories throughout Massachusetts. Gage was also powerless when the Massachusetts Assembly openly defied his orders and met to bolster the militia forces arrayed against him. In London, the colonial secretary deemed the colony to be an open rebellion against the crown. Gage's hand was forced, and on April 18, 1775, he sent 700 soldiers to capture colonial leaders and supplies being stockpiled in Concord. This was Paul Revere's second moment to shine, riding through the night to warn of the approaching regulars. The trap was set, and the first shots of the American Revolution rang out at Lexington, then again at Concord, as the British were forced into retreating back to their stronghold in Boston. 73 British soldiers were killed and another 174 wounded, compared to just 49 dead militiamen. Despite the outbreak of violence, the conflict remained localized as the Second Continental Congress convened 1 month later. The decisions that emerged from the Congress passed by the narrowest of margins, leaving a slim chance to avert further escalation. However, just as the Congress began its sessions, it received word that 3,000 British troops had attacked American formations at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. John Adams, a Boston native, urged the Congress to rise to the defense of American liberty, form a Continental Army, and appoint George Washington as its leader. He was joined by other fiery patriots, including Patrick Henry, who declared he was resolved to die a free man, rather than live as a slave to a foreign monarch. Seeking to maintain momentum, the newly minted Continental Army attacked Montreal in December 1775, but failed to secure Quebec City. Another early victory came when the upstart nation's unofficial navy successfully cut off exports to Britain and the West Indian Sugar Islands. In response, King George III issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. Parliament went a step further by passing the Prohibitory Act, which outlawed all trade with any colony involved in rebellion. The British hoped to peel off the colonies one by one, starting with the southern states, which were heavily dependent on the mother country for trade and credit. However, the rebellious spirit in America spread faster than news of England's threats. In Virginia, the militia forced Governor Dunmore to take refuge on a British warship. From there, Dunmore issued a proclamation that would forever change the scope of the war. He formed the Ethiopian Regiment, a group of 1,000 black soldiers, and attempted to incite a further slave uprising by promising freedom to any enslaved person who joined the British cause. Virginian James Madison immediately recognized the danger of such a proclamation, writing, "To say the truth, that is the only part in which this colony is vulnerable, and if we should be subdued, we shall fall like Achilles by the hand of one that knows that secret." This set up the dilemma faced by black soldiers. While freedom was promised to those who crossed lines, many individuals chose to remain loyal to the land of their birth. One such figure was Jehu Grant of Rhode Island, who escaped from his loyalist owner and enlisted in the Continental Army. For 10 months, Grant served with honor, explaining that he was inspired by songs of liberty that stirred his heart. George Washington, a slave owner himself, initially refused to allow black men to serve in the army, but eventually relented when it became clear how short of men he was. The Continental Congress never managed to provide him with even a third of the promised troops. Where black soldiers served, there were no segregated units, though entrenched racism was a daily reality. Black soldiers were often relegated to digging ditches, serving food, and maintaining camps rather than fighting on the front lines. The exception was the Rhode Island First, an all-black regiment that self-segregated in order to prove beyond a doubt that black men could fight as well as their white counterparts. The severe shortage of soldiers blunted the early successes of the Continental Army. After nearly 6 months of fighting, relief came in the form of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. The pamphlet laid out the case against King George III in relatively plain language, mixing insults with biblical quotations. The former Englishman's work went through 25 editions in just 6 months. Soon after, in July 1776, Thomas Jefferson completed the Declaration of Independence, articulating the idea that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed, who retain the right to overthrow them if they fail to protect the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Incredibly, Jefferson's first draft included passages condemning George III for his role in the evil transatlantic slave trade. The removal of these passages reflects both the tenuous balance in the war and among the colonies. Incendiary proclamations about slavery might have encouraged individual colonies to abandon the cause. In 1776, the loss of even one of the 13 colonies might have doomed the Revolution. Although Jefferson penned the Declaration, he relied heavily on Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, who argued that individuals abandon the state of nature and accept governance to ensure protection of life, liberty, and property. Ideas of natural rights, consent of the governed, and self-rule emerged from the Enlightenment, alongside Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory, which suggested that the king had continually broken his end of the bargain. Jefferson and his contemporaries also looked to Baron Montesquieu, who favored a republican form of government, especially for smaller nations. Montesquieu's concept of 3 separate branches of government would later form the basis of the United States Constitution, complete with its system of checks and balances. Thomas Paine's genius lay in simplifying these Enlightenment ideas for a wider audience. His accessible language, including his reference to the king as a pharaoh, expressed what many Americans were feeling. Yet by 1776, these philosophical ideas were merely words on paper. What the Continental Army needed was soldiers. After initial successes at Lexington and Concord, the tide turned in favor of the British during 1776 and 1777. The Patriots were outgunned, outmanned, and outplanned. British policies had ensured that the colonies remained subservient in terms of wealth, military equipment, and population. The British Navy was the most powerful in the world, and their standing army of 48,000 far outnumbered Washington's 18,000 poorly trained recruits. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress, functioning under the weak Articles of Confederation, lacked the authority to compel the states to provide troops. Northern farmers were reluctant to leave their lands and families, while Southern farmers feared returning home to find their families slaughtered in slave uprisings, and therefore never left their farms at all. Virginia resorted to drafting the dregs of society, men described as pests, who were eventually paid bonuses to quit. Maryland recruited former British convicts and indentured servants, promising them the equivalent of $2,000 a day, plus 100 acres of land after the war. Meanwhile, Native American nations like the Iroquois Confederacy recognized England's role in restraining settler expansion through the Proclamation of 1763. This became even more apparent when Daniel Boone led 30,000 settlers across the Appalachian Mountains to Kentucky, taking advantage of the war to encroach on native lands. Despite their struggle against the Crown, Boone's request for guns was granted by Virginia, despite them being in short supply. England could also rely on a substantial number of loyalists, colonists who remained opposed to the Revolution. Support for independence in America never exceeded 50%. With 15 to 30% of the white population remaining steadfastly loyal to Britain. In addition to England's manpower advantage, the U.S. lacked a central government and a reliable source of tax revenue. However, revolutions often turn into insurgencies, where the people's will to fight becomes more important than their military strength. George Washington and the Continental Army embodied this spirit for many Americans. As long as Washington could continue the fight, there was hope for a negotiated settlement. Britain's reluctance to annihilate the American forces allowed Washington to survive. Instead of crushing the Continental Army, the British hoped to humiliate them into submission. It looked like that submission would occur, as Washington seemed trapped during the Battle of New York in 1776, but managed to escape, first to New Jersey and then to Delaware. Winter intervened, saving him as the British suspended their military campaign and rested in occupied cities along the seaboard. General Howe, leading the British war effort, believed a political compromise was possible. In contrast, Washington decided that the war on our side should be defensive. He aimed to draw the British away from the coast, extend their supply lines, and wear down their morale. This strategy began with a daring Christmastime raid in 1776, immortalized in the painting Washington Crossing the Delaware. The artwork doesn't show the thousands of German mercenaries celebrating what they believed to be a holiday ceasefire. Washington's victory over them was a much-needed morale boost, inspiring more men to join the revolutionary cause. The colonists followed up the crossing with a victory at the Battle of Saratoga, a 1777 turning point that inspired the French to enter the war. The plan was to isolate the northern colonies from the rest of America. Boston, in particular, appeared to be the center of discontent. It was believed that if the city were cut off, the British could come to some sort of agreement with the southern and mid-Atlantic states. A three-pronged attack on Albany was planned, with Canadian forces coming south from Quebec, the Iroquois closing in from the west, and Howe's forces arriving from New York City. Seeing an opportunity to deliver a fatal blow to the cause, Howe turned the main portion of his army towards Philadelphia, the site of the Second Continental Congress. Although he was successful in taking Philadelphia, his replacement, Gentleman Johnny, moved so slowly that the colonists swarmed like birds of prey, forcing his 5,000 men to surrender. Rather than a fatal blow, the British were forced to blockade New York City. Without New York Harbor available to them, the city's population fell from 21,000 to just 10,000 residents. The colonial economy suffered, with hyperinflation settling in. It was here that women largely stepped up, making cloth for the soldiers, completing farm work, and demanding that state governments end price gouging. Women, like Molly Pitchers, even helped out where they could in the battlefield situations. In addition to sending men like Marquis de Lafayette to help train the colonial soldiers, France provided immediate loans that helped stabilize the economy. Morale stopped plummeting, but Saratoga didn't guarantee victory. First, Washington had to survive the winter at Valley Forge, which was so difficult that 200 colonial officers resigned, 1,000 soldiers deserted, and 3,000 died from malnutrition and disease. That winter at Valley Forge claimed as many American lives as had the previous 2 years of fighting. The British could have easily swept through the camp and eradicated the colonial army, but they were content to watch the Americans suffer from their heated buildings 20 miles away in Philadelphia. Still, in the words of Prussian officer Baron von Steuben, who, like Lafayette, had come to train the colonists, the smaller army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was a much tougher and better disciplined force. France and the U.S. were unlikely partners. One was a Catholic monarchy, while the other was a Protestant federation of republics. The two had been opposite sides of the French and Indian War, and the settlers hadn't welcomed the remnants of the French Empire with open arms after the peace agreement. In this instance, the alliance was best expressed by the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. France had long desired revenge against the British for seizing Canada. In addition to expecting the loans to be repaid, France demanded that the U.S. recognize their efforts to reconquer French territories in the Caribbean. The war was unpopular in England, as its people had long realized that wars in America resulted in the accumulation of debt. In 1778, the king authorized his prime minister, Lord North, to seek a negotiated settlement. He offered to repeal the Tea and Other Acts, which would effectively renounce England's power to tax the colonies without consent. The Patriots rejected the overture, as they could see that the tide was turning in their favor. Unable to successfully strangle New York City into submission, England pivoted to a Southern strategy, actively recruiting Southern slaves to their cause by issuing the 1779 Philipsburg Proclamation, which declared that any slave who deserted a rebel master would receive protection, freedom, and land. 30,000 slaves immediately joined their ranks. In December of 1778, the British Army marched against Savannah, Georgia, with their baggage train being carried by former slaves. By year's end, they controlled coastal Georgia and were poised to invade South Carolina. A year of victories in the South was capped by the arrival of Lord Cornwallis, who took over the British war effort. He immediately defeated Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, and took control of Charleston, South Carolina's capital. With the Southern strategy working, Marquis de Lafayette led French troops onto the American mainland, threatening New York City. Washington hastened north to support the effort, leaving behind Nathanael Greene to harass the British in the Carolinas. Greene's nimble forces waged a war of attrition, forcing the British to concede the Carolinas and move north, seeking to earn a decisive victory in Virginia. To counter the impending arrival of Washington and the French forces in New York, England placed a massive army under the command of former Patriot General Benedict Arnold. The turncoat had participated in the siege of Boston, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, and the Battle of Saratoga, where he was wounded. He was never popular with his men, however, as they accused him multiple times of trying to profit from the war. The personal animosity between Washington and Benedict Arnold helped convince Cornwallis that the Continental Army was indeed heading north towards New York, leaving Virginia undefended and vulnerable. Washington, however, doubled back and managed to surround Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia. It was a well-coordinated ambush, with the newly arrived French fleet cutting off retreat via the Atlantic. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October of 1781, paving the way for the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The agreement would have taken even longer had Spain and France had their way. They delayed agreeing to peace while they were plundering the British Empire in the Caribbean. In the final treaty, England recognized the U.S. and relinquished claims to lands south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River. Indian allies were forced to give up millions of acres to New York, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. One native leader expressed that in endeavoring to assist you, it seems we have wrought our own ruin. 100,000 loyalists abandoned the North American continent after the defeat. To their credit, the British forces remained true to their word and resettled tens of thousands of African Americans who had joined their cause. The newly minted Americans weren't so kind, re-enslaving runaways and turncoats. Freed blacks and women who had aided the cause waited in vain for their sacrifices to be rewarded through an extension of the so-called inalienable rights. Winning the war was one thing. Now the colonies needed to figure out how to govern themselves. The individual colonies had developed their own state constitutions within 6 months of the Declaration of Independence. Although each had Republican principles, all of them were different from one another. John Adams' Massachusetts Constitution had virtually no input from anyone outside the metropolis of Boston. His wife, Abigail Adams, led the charge for the inclusion of women's rights in the new charters. She criticized her husband and the other founding fathers for emancipating all nations from monarchical despotism while retaining absolute power over their wives. Connecticut and Rhode Island merely deleted the word king from their original charters, while Pennsylvania abolished property ownership as a qualification for voting. New Jersey went even further, allowing unmarried and widowed female property holders to vote. South Carolina, on the other hand, used property rules to disqualify about 90% of white men from holding office. The new nation had to act quickly, as several issues were coming due. Colonial soldiers hadn't been paid during the war, which had largely been financed by war bonds, which would have to be paid off within a few years. Additionally, Western Americans were demanding that the new state governments be more responsive to their needs than the Royalists had been. Those needs often involved protection against indigenous tribes who were defending their lands from encroachment. The Proclamation Line of 1763 had been erased, and settlers immediately began to flood into the West. The issue of slavery also reared its ugly head, with Virginia Methodists calling for general emancipation in 1785. These early abolitionists were opposed by men and women who used the revolutionary ideals to argue for the cause of the enslaved, pointing out that they had risked their lives and fortunes and waded through seas of blood to secure the possession of their rights to liberty and property. The Articles of Confederation were woefully inadequate to deal with these problems. This standard operating procedure update to the government was approved in November of 1777, creating a loose union in which each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. It was formally ratified in 1781. Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance, tried to expand the Confederation's authority, but the Articles lacked an empowered central government, relying instead on the goodwill of the states. Bankrupt, Morris hoped to charter a national bank and institute a 5% import tax. Realizing that it would personally hurt them, New York vetoed the act. Unable to pay their debts that way, the states began to sell off Western lands, arguing falsely that the 1783 Treaty of Paris had extinguished the Indians' right to their lands. In an attempt to control the massive waves of settlers that flooded west, the Continental Congress created the Ordinance of 1784 to link population growth to statehood. The Ordinance of 1785 followed, organizing the land sales into large single blocks of 23,040 acres, ensuring that the rich would be the only ones who could afford the new land. Rather than deter the common man, this ordinance meant that tens of thousands would settle the West as squatters rather than property holders. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created the territories that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Slavery was prohibited in this section of America, ensuring a geographical division between the free North and the enslaved South. It was the first, but definitely not the last time that America kicked the issue of slavery down the road. At this point in time, the North hadn't explicitly forbidden slavery, but the region's geographical climate ensured that there was no profitability in slave ownership for Northerners. The constant influx of immigrants, particularly from Ireland, meant that slaves weren't needed in the factories. However, the Northwest Territory had fertile farmland. The imposition of anti-slave provisions in that area should be seen as an abolitionist statement, rather than mere economic indifference. The land ordinances provided for orderly settlement and the admission of new states on the basis of equality, but they also leaned directly into America's original sins. Extending the geographical division between slave and free areas would haunt the nation in the coming decades, while simultaneously invalidating Native American claims to ancestral lands. Those were problems for the future. In the immediate aftermath, Daniel Shays led 4,000 disgruntled farmers and former colonial soldiers in protest against the Massachusetts legislature. These men had been forced to sell their war bonds to wealthy bankers. Those bonds were their promised payment for their service during the war. And when they sold it to the wealthy bankers, it was often at a fraction of their value. Still burdened by the cost of post-war rebuilding, the state imposed new taxes on these poor Western farmers, those who had risked the most during the war, in order to pay off the wealthy bondholders. A local militia dispersed Shays' mob, but the rebellion, just a few years after independence had been won, exposed the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation. George Washington, who had retired from public life after the war to farm, much like the ancient Roman Cincinnatus, wrote to James Madison, expressing concern that everything sacrificed in the Revolution was in danger of being invalidated by a government with 13 states, each pulling in different directions, without a central government to direct them. In 1787, a group of colonial elites met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The significance of the event was underscored by George Washington agreeing to preside over the convention. It was a gathering of revolutionary leaders, but notable figures like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were absent due to their ambassadorships. John Hancock, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams each refused to attend, fearing a strong central government. Patrick Henry, author of the famous line, "Give me liberty or give me death," declared that he smelled a rat and opted to stay away. Had he attended, perhaps he would have infused the resulting Constitution with his own brand of libertarian flair. 5 days into the meeting, the delegates decided to scrap the Articles of Confederation entirely and start anew. The result was the U.S. Constitution, a document shaped by compromise. Small and large states each proposed different plans for the structure of government. James Madison's Virginia plan called for representation based on population, but New Jersey argued this would unfairly empower larger states and proposed maintaining equal representation for each state, as under the Articles of Confederation. Roger Sherman steered a middle course with the Connecticut Compromise, establishing a bicameral legislature. The lower House of Representatives would be based on population, while the Senate would represent all states equally, with 2 senators per state. Although the framers claimed to believe in Enlightenment ideals such as the consent of the governed, they introduced several checks on direct democracy. Senators were to be appointed by state legislatures, rather than elected directly by the people. Additionally, the Electoral College was created as a buffer against the possibility of a populist leader rising through corruption. A second major compromise dealt with the distribution of power between state and national governments. A system of federalism was devised, assigning expressed, implied, and reserved powers to both levels of government. The final and perhaps most contentious compromise addressed slavery. The North wanted slaves to count towards population totals when calculating taxes, but not for representation in Congress. The South wanted the exact opposite. The 3/5 compromise settled the matter, counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for both taxation and representation. Despite 39 of the 55 delegates voting in favor of the new governing document, it still needed approval from 9 states to be ratified. To sway the public, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay authored the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays explaining how federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances would work in practice. While anti-federalist papers emerged in opposition, this movement lacked unity, with critics opposing the Constitution for diverse reasons, ranging from fears of a standing army to concerns over high taxes or recreating British rule. Ultimately, the inclusion of the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments guaranteeing individual and states' rights, swayed enough states to ratify the Constitution. After ratification, the new government faced the challenge of staffing 2 entirely new branches, the executive and judicial, as well as electing or appointing a new Congress. Federalists dominated the election of 1788, taking 44 of the 52 available seats. The Electoral College unanimously selected George Washington as the nation's first president, though he had initially been reluctant to accept the position. John Adams, who received the second highest number of votes, became vice president. Washington quickly assembled his first cabinet, appointing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. These choices reflected Washington's view that the federal government's core purposes were international relations, the economy, and national defense. The newly formed Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, establishing a federal district court in each state, 3 circuit courts of appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court, with John Jay as the first Chief Justice. The court, however, would not become a significant force until John Marshall's tenure, which saw the rise of judicial review as a means of strengthening federal authority. Meanwhile, conflict arose between Hamilton and Jefferson, both serving in Washington's administration. Hamilton, who was even more extreme than most Federalists, pushed for policies that would bolster centralized power, including the establishment of a national bank to assume state wartime debts. Jefferson, an advocate for states' rights, opposed Hamilton's vision, arguing for a decentralized government. The two clashed repeatedly, but Hamilton won many early battles, including securing the bank's creation. To appease Southern interests, Hamilton agreed to support the construction of the nation's capital along the Potomac River, allowing suspicious Southerners to keep a close eye on federal operations. Washington had also agreed to support Hamilton's national bank, but only if Hamilton could devise a way to pay for it, along with the associated debt. Hamilton's solution involved taxing whiskey and imposing higher tariffs on foreign imports, not to protect domestic industries, but purely to raise revenue. Although these measures successfully generated customs revenue to reduce the national debt, they sparked widespread protests among Western Pennsylvania farmers in 1794, who viewed the whiskey tax as oppressive. Washington responded by raising a militia force of 12,000 troops to disperse the protesters, demonstrating the Federalists' willingness to use military power to maintain order. Another key area of disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson concerned the French Revolution. Jefferson wanted to support the French revolutionaries, whose actions were inspired by the same Enlightenment ideals that had fueled the American Revolution. However, both Washington and Adams favored a pro-British foreign policy, straining relations with France. The increasing division within Washington's cabinet laid the groundwork for the formation of political parties. Despite earlier warnings from the Federalist Papers about the dangers of factions, Jefferson, aligning with James Madison, formed the Democratic-Republican Party, marking the start of America's first party system. Federalists, representing merchants, creditors, and wealthy slaveholders, found themselves at odds with Democratic Republicans, who drew support from Southern planters, Western farmers, and ethnic minorities like the Germans and Scots-Irish. By the time of the 1796 election, Washington had chosen to step down after 2 terms, warning the nation in his farewell address about the dangers of political parties, long-term leadership, and entanglements in foreign affairs. John Adams won the presidency with Thomas Jefferson as vice president, a clear reflection of the ideological rift between the 2 major parties. Adams' pro-British stance combined with Jefferson's sympathy for the French widened this gap further. Tensions with France escalated during Adams' presidency, culminating in the XYZ affair, in which French officials demanded a bribe to stop harassing American ships. Adams refused, cutting off trade with France and authorizing privateers to seize French vessels. This undeclared quasi-war played into the hands of the Federalists, who began taking a harder line, not only against foreign enemies, but also domestic critics. The administration passed the Naturalization Act, making it more difficult for immigrants to become U.S. citizens, followed by the Alien Act, which allowed for the deportation of non-citizens, and the Sedition Act, which criminalized criticism of the president or Congress. For the first time in the nation's history, the First Amendment had come under serious attack. Federalist prosecutors arrested more than 20 Republican newspaper editors and politicians, jailing several. The Supreme Court, still in its infancy, remained quiet, and with it being packed with Federalist judges, Republicans didn't have much faith in appealing their cases. Instead, Jefferson and Madison encouraged Kentucky and Virginia to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts, asserting states' rights to judge the constitutionality of federal laws, a principle that would echo throughout American history. An early crisis was brewing, but Adams chose to handle it fairly. As the 1800 election approached, Adams could have doubled down on jailing his critics or used the military to enforce his properly passed laws. He also could have wagged the dog by declaring war against France, triggering a rally around the flag effect to secure re-election. Instead, he put country above party and used diplomacy to end the undeclared maritime conflict. Jefferson, John Adams' vice president and primary opponent, didn't follow this example. Rather than calming the waters, Jefferson stirred tensions, setting the stage for the first bitter, no-holds-barred presidential election in American history. A low turnout in Virginia and Pennsylvania, along with the South's advantage in the Electoral College due in part to the 3/5 compromise, saw Jefferson win the presidency. In a surprising twist, Jefferson and Aaron Burr of New York had campaigned together, each receiving 73 votes in the Electoral College. This sent the election to the House of Representatives, where each state would cast exactly one vote. Federalists, upset at losing the presidency for the first time, followed Alexander Hamilton's advice to prolong the process as much as possible. 35 rounds of balloting led to rumors that Virginia, Jefferson's home state, was considering raising a militia to install him by force. Hamilton eventually relented, backing Jefferson while denouncing Burr as an embryo Caesar and the most unfit man in the United States for the office of president. The insults culminated in a duel between Burr, then vice president, and Hamilton, resulting in Hamilton's death. Jefferson finally took the reins of the nation, declaring his victory the Revolution of 1800. This wasn't an exaggeration, as the newly empowered Democratic Republicans introduced significant changes to the nation. In a nod to farmers and settlers, Jefferson reversed the government's policies on Native Americans. Previously, the government had favored assimilating natives by dividing their tribally held land into individual plots for native families. But the policy had largely failed. Jefferson embraced one interpretation of the Treaty of Paris, which argued that the natives' support for Britain meant they had forfeited their land rights. A wave of new treaties followed this victory, with Native Americans being forced off of their ancestral lands. Between 1790 and 1810, farm families settled as much land as they had during the entire colonial period. Washington had initially tried to stem the tide, but he admitted that nothing short of a Chinese wall or a line of troops will restrain the encroachment of settlers upon Indian territory. But under Jefferson, the floodgates opened. He made it easier for families to acquire land, cutting the price from $2 per acre to $1.25. He also eased credit terms and allowed illegal squatters to purchase their land to legitimize their claims. Jefferson expanded U.S. territory even further with the unexpected Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, who sold the land after facing difficulties subduing a revolution in Haiti. The settlement of Louisiana, however, was delayed until after the Lewis and Clark expedition surveyed the new acquisition. Jefferson reversed several long-standing Federalist policies while engaging in a 4-year war with North African pirates. He allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire and restored the shorter period for immigrants to become naturalized citizens. Under Jefferson, the government shrank in size and scope. He abolished all internal taxes, including the hated whiskey tax, and reduced the size of the standing army. The biggest surprise, however, was his tolerance of Hamilton's National Bank. Nevertheless, Jefferson's policies helped reduce the national debt from $83 million in 1801 down to $45 million by 1812. He would have accomplished more, but he was limited by a judiciary stacked with Federalists. After his defeat, John Adams issued a series of midnight appointments to the judiciary, creating new courts to ensure Federalist control over key judicial positions. One of these appointments, William Marbury's, had not gone through, leading to the landmark Marbury v. Madison case. This case established the principle of judicial review, granting the Supreme Court the power to determine the constitutionality of laws. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, would use this newfound authority to significantly expand federal power in cases like McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden. During Jefferson's presidency, the U.S. shifted from a pro-British foreign policy, setting the stage for the War of 1812. This and other conflicts will be covered in our upcoming episodes, which explore AP Period 4. We covered it very briefly, so I will point out that if you are interested in the Haitian Revolution, which is the only effective slave revolution in world history, please look at my sister podcast series, Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments. That can be found anywhere that you get your podcasts.